Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Sex That Taught Me. This is your host, Natalie Walton. This week I have on a new guest, Kassie, and we talk a lot about growing up and understanding our bodies, and also extensively talk about books and the importance of representation, especially in young adult and middle grade novels, things that we both feel really passionately about. It's just a really fun time, and I love this episode and I love talking with her. So without further ado, here's Kassie. All right, so can you tell me a little bit about your hometown or hometowns growing up? So like socially, politically, even like geographically, where were you?
Yeah, so I grew up in South Florida in a city called Sunrise, but it's more of like a small, not small town, but like a mini town in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And that's primarily where I grew up. I mean, it was kind of a diverse town. There were people of different ethnicities and identities. I grew up primarily in like a Puerto Rican household, so that was always super fun and lively, I guess. And so a lot of my interactions growing up were with people of other races. My best friend was Lebanese. I had a lot of other Latinx friends who I didn't realize were Latinx, so I got a lot older. And I think that's just like part of the socialization process. Like when you're in your own communities, you're just like, oh, well, like everyone eats rice and beans. And so that's great. So I grew up between Fort Lauderdale, and I also grew up, sometimes I spent a lot of my summers in the Bronx in New York City with my grandmother and my aunts. So I got to see sort of like the contrasting of more of like a city atmosphere, and then also more of a semi-city, not so city atmosphere living in Sunrise. So, yeah.
And then how would you say your communities were politically? Like, was there a noticeable difference in maybe the way, like the interactions you had, or the way that people leaned, or just kind of the conversations they would have between the two locations?
Yeah, I think that predominantly both places that I grew up in, my hometowns, were, I would say, mostly liberal. I mean, I think that there were some parts of both of the communities that were somewhat conservative in just like their thinking and their ideologies. And I think a lot of that stems from the relationship that religion has to play with a lot of Latinx identities. But they were primarily pretty open. Yeah, so they were okay. Yeah.
And then I'm assuming you had your sex ed in Florida just because you mentioned only spending summers in New York typically. So how was your sex ed in Florida? Like, what was your experience like there?
Yeah, sex ed in Florida was wild. So it was like all over the place. So I started sex ed. They like did it in modules starting from like the 5th grade. And in the 5th grade, like I remember this, they like talked about like your period, and it was like so taboo. And they like separated the girls and the guys into like 2 separate rooms. And like for me, I like got my period in the 3rd grade, so I was like, I know what this is. Like I know what cramps are. I know that my vagina is bleeding. Like it's just a thing. And so we're in this room and they're talking about like periods and menstruation, and I like raised my hand and I was like, do I need to be here? Like I already have this. Like my mom and I have already had the talk. And they just like looked at me, and I was like, I'm sorry. Like I'm 11 years old in this class, and my mom was like pretty like open about menstruation and like the woman's body. And I think that that just comes from just like being in a predominantly woman household. My dad was the only male presenting individual. And so it was just very interesting. And then when we got into like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade is like sort of when they started to build off of that. So I think in 6th grade, it was a lot of like sort of abstinence, but like also not really. It was more of, don't do this. Here is a video of a woman giving birth. Here are condoms. like we never like put a condom on any banana or anything like that, but they were like, use a condom, use something to protect yourself. But it wasn't, I think, until like 7th grade science where like I had this super badass like science teacher named Ms. Vandercook, and she like really went in. She was like, your body is your body, and like you should do things that feel good to you, and you should be safe while you do it. And I think she gave like more of a comprehensive thing that wasn't just abstinence. I think she was like, you know, wait until you know that it's right. But when you know it is right, here are like forms of contraception that definitely should happen. And here are places to get free forms of contraception. And so I was like really appreciative of that. And then by the 8th grade, it just seemed like they were just regurgitating things to just like meet state standards. And I was like, okay, not gonna have sex, but also thanks, I guess. but even like with the comprehensive, and I use like air quotes here, like with the comprehensive like sex education, there were still like so many questions that I had about sex. I was like, oh, so like if I touch myself here and I flick the bean and it feels good, like will I get pregnant? Like no, of course not, right? But like they don't talk about that shit in school. And so, yeah, that was like more or less what it was. I don't think my parents like never sat down and like had the talk with me. They kind of just were like, oh, well, our child reads and they'll figure it out on their own. And I mean, they were right. I'm really grateful for a lot of like young adult literature. Like Amy Reads Beautiful is like a perfect example of like, I remember reading the book and learning about like condoms and learning about abortions and learning more in depth, I think, about a lot of the sex education that was not prevalent within the current curriculum that the Florida state standards had for, you know, what, 5th through 8th graders. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I got any in high school that I know of, I think, which is kind of interesting given that we had a biology class, but yeah. That was a little bit about my sex ed. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting because the first thing that stands out to me is that you started a lot younger than I did. Like my first, like I mean, I had that kind of like period talk or whatever, like, you know, where they divide people up and they're like, okay, here's a video, good luck, like figure it out. I think that happened maybe like 5th grade. And then we didn't have like basically any form of sex ed again until like 9th grade, at least for me in my school. Yeah, they were kind of just like, oh, maybe we should talk about this. Like, because I remember having like health classes and like we talked mostly, like it was, you know, throughout middle school. I think I had at least one I can say confidently, but I'm like, I think that was mostly prioritizing like, you know, drinking and drug use and stuff like that. But I don't think we really ever had like a formal sex talk. If we did, it was like one class and it was something where everyone was like, you know, blushing and giggling the whole time and was like, oh my God, like we didn't learn anything. Like it didn't make an impression on me. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting that you started noticeably younger in a lot of ways, and by the time you reached high school you were kind of like, well, you know, their school is just like, well, there's nothing else to talk about, so like,
yeah, like I thought that there was nothing else to talk about, and then I had sex for the first time. I was like, oh, they don't cover this in sex ed, do they? It hurts. like, it hurts a lot. So it was also really funny because like when I started, I always thought it was just really weird, and maybe this was just like the baby feminist in me that like didn't know they were a feminist but just like knew that the system was like really corrupt, where they were like, take home this permission slip to like talk about your body. And I was like, I'm not showing my mother this. Like I should have the own autonomy as like an 11-year-old to like talk about my body and to like learn about it. And I don't need my parents' permission for it. And I understand like why they do it, but also like, like, you know, if the kid wants to know, the kid wants to know. Like it's inevitable. It's gonna happen, right? Like lunch tables in middle school are a thing. Middle school boys are a thing, right? Like, you know, you very much early on learn what porn is, like easily by the 6th grade. And so that was always just really interesting to me. And then the fact that they also just like separated us, you know, where like it was based off of gender, always made me question about like, what about those kids or those students who like don't identify with either gender and like have a very different like relationship to puberty and their body, and like what does that look like? And so I think like very early on I was asking myself these questions, but I didn't have like the literature backing that I do now to really like put into words like why this feeling that I was feeling was so bad, which is just like a picture.
Yeah, no, I really love that point because I feel like I've spent most of my adult life trying to figure out why certain things made me so uncomfortable as a kid. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I think back on it and I'm like, okay, what was it that was missing? Like, what was nobody telling me? And it's like, I spent so much of my life trying to catch up on what wasn't being told and all figuring out, you know, like, oh, wait, yeah, that was really weird. Like, I don't think I like that.
Yes, absolutely. And it like, I just also think it's really silly, especially when you're talking about like periods and then like the guy process. Like, I don't even know what the hell a guy does to go through puberty. I just know that they get like an Adam's apple and their voice drops and they're like, oh, you're a man, right? And so it's like, it's also very interesting to me to see very early on how we continue to create like these systems of division within our education system that is predicated and created off of like what are taboo subjects, which oftentimes can be, you know, distinguished or created by like, do we talk about the women's body and what pleasure actually is? And so it's like, I think that it probably would have been more educational to put all of us in the room and be like, no, men, like you're going to learn about the uterus and like you're going to learn that like we bleed and it's not something to be grossed by, and we're going to learn whatever happens to you. And I think that that is a more comprehensive educational approach versus separating and like really continuing to play off of like this feeling and like this rhetoric of like a smoke screen of, you don't really know, we're just gonna like touch the little parts that we need to and keep it moving. So yeah no, I've always, because it's, I mean, there are people who reach like college and they still don't fully understand like what the vagina is. Like they'll be like, oh well, you know, it's like, yeah, the tampon goes in the body and that's it. They just like, they don't really understand, or like they, you know, won't even understand the concept of like a pad or something, or I think about the story constantly about, is it NASA sent an astronaut into space with like 100 tampons for a week, and they were like, is this going to be enough? Like, and it's like, I just, yeah, it's like, you know, stuff like that where it's like, maybe if we learned this stuff earlier and we kind of had conversations about it, we wouldn't have, you know, adults who are sitting around like, wait, so how does the vagina actually work? Like, wait, what do you do with the tampon? Like, where does it go? Yeah, I've met men like even outside of college who are just like, oh, so like your pad goes on your underwear, and I'm like, where the fuck did you think it went? like how else am I supposed to get it on my body? Like I'm confusion. Like I really am. Oh yeah, I agree with you. It's really disheartening, but I mean, I also understand that it's not like the people, right? It's the product of the environment by which they've been socialized and taught within that has created sort of these limitations to lack of knowledge in terms of what the sex look like, or even just the vagina, which is a very beautiful thing. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And then, so when you're thinking back, you mentioned getting your period, what, third grade? Was that pretty young? When did you learn about sex in that process? Like, was the period like kind of the beginning of like, oh, like I'm growing up, like, you know, sudden awareness of like what your future was going to look like? Or was it kind of a gradual process, or did you learn even younger kind of that there was this idea of like kissing and dating and like, you know, what went on behind closed doors and that kind of idea?
Yeah, I think I sort of like knew what sex was because I was like one of those like young kids who would watch Desperate Housewives with their mom and like Grey's Anatomy. So I like knew more or less what sexy time the dance with no pants looked like through the screen, but like I didn't know how to dance with no pants. I just was like, oh, well, it's here. So I would say like I knew what sex was. I knew sort of like what kissing was. But it was always really interesting to me the way that sex was taught growing up as a fat girl, because it was always like, oh, well, in order for this thing to even happen to you, you need to lose weight. And for me, I was like, I'm going to rebel. And I think that, like I said, the inner baby feminist in me just like crawling out of my skin. And so I think I like always knew what it was. And then when I got to middle school, I hung out with a lot of dudes, and they kind of were just like, have you checked out this porn site? I'm like, I don't know what the hell that is. Like, I don't know what porn is. Until one day I just like said, fuck it, I'm going to do it. Pull up the private browser. Right. And so I don't know, I would say like I taught a lot, I taught myself a lot about sex, right? And then I became curious in terms of like, what does touching yourself, like what are the places on my own body that feel pleasurable for me? And And I think that that's fine. And I think that that's a part of like discovery and like becoming a young individual who is sexually active. And I think that oftentimes we very much taboo people for touching themselves. It's like, no, they're like, that's their body. I'm a very strong believer in like body justice. And I think that there are certain principles within body justice, I think, that should be instilled in young people when they're like in middle school. And I think that's very liberatory. So yeah, it definitely started with Desperate Housewives. Definitely like knew, I think from the beginning, like when I felt particular feelings, I was like, oh, wow, I want to do that in bed one day when I'm grown. Yeah. So I don't know. My mom was kind of just like, I'm going to introduce you to these things. And if it like gets too out of hand, like I'll tell you to cover your eyes, but I can like still hear it. Right. And so that was always really interesting. When I got my period, you know, as I said earlier, my mom was like very open about it. And like, I remember sort of like following her into the bathroom when she was younger, as like a child does. And just like her talking to me about her period. And then when I got it, I was like, oh my God, like my vagina is bleeding. Like, this is terrible. Like, it was a fun time. But I don't think that I really sort of put it into, like, I don't think anyone ever really made the connection between, oh, well, like now that you have your period, you can get pregnant. And I think that was something that eventually sort of connected. But I don't think it was a conversation that was ever had. But for me, I think what was preventing it from being an issue was the fact that like growing up being taught that because your body does not fit this idealistic notion of like super thin and petite means that in and of itself is like this physical form of abstinence that prevents you from being pregnant. And so I think that in many ways my body has created both of like these physical limitations that prevented me as a young kid to see like the sexual world that is possible for me as Kassie. And then there's also just like this part where it's like not knowing, but being curious and discovering and learning the body in sort of your own language and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier like you've mentioned a couple of different ways that you've learned about sex growing up already. So like you talked about, you know, your mom, books, friends. Was there any other way, like and TV actually. So was there any other way that you can think of that really had an influence on you? Like, was it like, I know for me, like music videos of all things was like a really like kind of interesting experience for me in terms of like kind of growing up and being like, oh, wait, like what's going on here? So I was wondering if you just had any other kind of experiences like that outside of, or if you've already touched on kind of all of the sources you had that were coming into play with learning about sex.
Yeah, I mean, now that you say music, I had like a huge obsession with Fat Joe and like just how extremely masculine he was. And I remember being like, how do I like also exert masculinity in my relationship to my body as a fat person? I don't know. So that was something that was also relatively pretty interesting. But a lot of it did come from friends, family, just like own self-discovery. Like we both grew up in the age of Google, right? Especially when you're first starting up. And so you just Google things and it comes about. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just self-interest, researching, and then also just trying to connect the dots as much as possible. I don't think that there was ever a world where I was frustrated that I didn't know enough. I think for me, I was just like more scared of it, which could have been a product of, you know, the sex education that I was receiving in school, or it could have just been a whole, I don't want a child and I feel like this is what's going to happen. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and okay, so I had the same experience growing up of like reading books, and that was kind of my primary, like, I know for me, the extent of like my sex ed talk or like even like puberty talk was my mom giving me that like American Girl doll book that was like You and Your Body or something. I can't remember what the exact title is, but it's an infamous book. There's a lot of people, I think, in our general age group who ended up getting it. And that was like the extent of what I ended up learning about. And from there, it was kind of like books were my primary source. Like I started reading probably like young adult, I want to say maybe like 4th or 5th grade. And then it's like, it very quickly kind of like went out from there. Yeah. And then it's kind of like you're reading stuff and you're like, Oh, okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I started reading Twilight, like the Twilight saga in the fifth grade. And my fifth grade teacher flipped shit. She was like, why are you reading that? Like, it's talking about lust and like they obviously want to have sex. And I remember she like talked to my mom about it. Mom was like, my kid's gonna read what my kid's gonna want to read, and I'm happy that they're reading. Like, you should just be happy that they're picking up this like 900-page brick that could have been easily concised in like 40 pages and just reading, right? And so I definitely relate to that too. Books was a huge thing. I say Amy Reed for a couple reasons. Her book, Beautiful, I remember I grew up, say like a 5-minute walk from the public library. I would go in there.
I love that.
Yes.
What a treat.
Oh yeah, it was wonderful. And as a kid, even growing up, I would go every single day with my dad, and we would just like pile up these books like to the sky, because I grew up just like asking a whole bunch of questions. I was a very curious kid, and so I would just pile books up to the sky, go home, read them, and then like return the next day. And so I remember it was around like fourth, fifth grade, and I was getting into young adult. I went to like this new stack and I pulled out Beautiful by Amy Reed. And around that time, I was very frustrated because a lot of the protagonists didn't have my name, Cassandra. And I felt that that's always something really important for a young person to connect to if they ever see their name, you know, being used in the literature. And so I picked it up and I started reading, and it was about like this girl. I haven't read in a long time, and I actually just ordered a copy a couple of days ago, so I'm excited to read it. But this girl named Cassandra who lives in Seattle, and she is discovering sort of her identity in relationship to sex, in relationship to drugs and alcohol and violence, and sort of what does that community look like. And so for me, I think that was like a huge opener to like sex and freedom in action, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, like sex, freedom, and action. Yeah, and I think that sort of is what opened it. And then when I got to high school and I was involved in debate, those just sparked tons of questions about sex, and gender and sexuality, and oh yeah, crazy stories.
And would you say that you learned most of your information after a certain point through Google? Like you started just like asking your questions that way? Because I know for some people growing up, like I didn't have this, but there's an option for like dropping questions like in a box anonymously, or there was like a website to submit questions to that their teacher would answer or something like that. So did you have anything like that, like an adult in your life where you felt like you could go and just like ask them any question that was on your mind?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think for me, it was, you know, a lot of the Google, and then just like a lot through experience. Like I lost my virginity pretty early. I lost it when I was 15. So around that time, I gathered all of the knowledge that I needed. And then I was like, all right, time to try it, I guess. And so you like learn a lot, you know, as you have sex, from what I have learned throughout my years of having sex. And so it was a lot of just like trial and error, and also just figuring out what feels good, what doesn't. And then also like, how do I articulate, you know, what feels good and what doesn't, and sort of finding confidence in my voice as I go about a very intimate and pleasurable and like liberating act. So.
Yeah, no, I love the direction that you took on that with the idea of like, how do I have fun with this? Like, it's not necessarily, because I feel like a lot of the narrative around sex is like, how do I be better? Like, how do I do this better? How can I give like the best blowjob or something like that?
Yes.
And it's like, okay, that's great. Like, I'm glad but it's also like, it's good to ask yourself that and be like, what am I missing? Like what needs to happen here for me?
Yes. Sex should be so fun. Like, it's supposed to be fun. And like, if you're with a partner and you're having sex and like you can't voice your concerns, or like you can't say, hey, this like really fucking hurts, please stop, then I feel like there's sort of this I don't know, like the pleasure gets taken out of it for sure. But no, I definitely agree with what you said. Being able to articulate it is nice. And I think that people are just scared because they're like, how do I perform to like the porn star level of sex? And it's like, not everyone's a porn star. Like, you are your own, right? Like, you are beautiful, you are here, you are throwing it back sometimes, like it exists, right? So yeah, no, I love the idea of trial and error. I think that's such an important thing. Like, it's, you know, you don't have to know all the answers before you go in. Like, it's and if your partner expects that of you, it's
not fair of them and you should have a conversation. Like, I feel like that's one of those things where it's, you know, it is, you get better, you figure out what works for you as you grow up. You know, you're not going to know immediately going in kind of what to expect, how it's going to work, how your body's going to respond. Like, it's, you know, you just have to figure it out. Sometimes it might take a couple times with even the same person of figuring it out. Like, it's, you know, there's no secret to it. It's just,
there really isn't. And I think like a lot of that is just the product of education not providing like more spaces to be open about sex and the agency that comes within sex and learning the pleasure of it. I think that it focuses a lot, you know, many curriculums focus on abstinence, which you, I'm sure, are like an expert in. Many people just like don't talk about it or say, you know, I have my roommate is the residential lesbian in my house, and she's
I love that.
Yeah, we call it, I've named her that, and it's great. So it's just her and I had a conversation with her the other day. I was like, so what was sex ed like for you in Southern rural West Virginia? And she was like, yeah, like the priest came and said, if we have kids, they'll be the devil. And I was like, oh, okay. So like, that's what sex ed looks like in these particular geographies. Got it. Right. Yeah, so I think a lot of the taboo and abstinence nature of it prevents young people, especially when they do become sexually active, to realize that sex is a process and learning to be good and what you like is something that comes and evolves over time. And it's not something to be shamed in. It's something to really embrace and grow within, because as you grow in your sexual endeavors, you also grow, I think, like more intimate with yourself. And I think that a lot of them, I think that it's very connected, right? You're not just like having sex with a person, but you are also filling yourself with this mushy feeling of goodness and like, yes, and like power and confidence. And it should be something that you constantly go back to and you get good at, however we want to define that good as, but it's also something that doesn't need to be so regulated and controlled because we weren't given the spaces and the systems to really sort of have us confront, you know, what it means to be good at the head, right? So.
Yeah, awesome. And then, so what were you, kind of actually related to what we were just talking about, what were you told about sex? So like the story that you just shared with your roommate, it was kind of this feeling of like, don't do this. It's bad. It's potentially, you know, sinful. Like just don't. But what was the message that you got from your sex ed? Or do you feel like you got different messages from like at home versus your friends versus in school versus maybe even the books you read, like that kind of idea? Like what messages were you actually being told to think about sex?
So I would say at home, my parents were just like, don't do it. And I was like, okay, you're my parents. I won't do it. Right. At school, I got more of a, I don't know, it was very like conflated just based off of who was teaching it. So when it was like my cis male science teacher, it was very like, here's a woman giving birth. And I'm like, okay, like, all right. But when it was like Miss Vandercook, it was very like, here, like sex is good and it's great. But here's sort of how we can be safe with it. But even within sort of like these informative periods of my life on sex ed, there were still some disconnections that were there. I don't know. I think learned a lot just at the lunch table, right? You know, whether that was like blue waffle or do you know what head is? You know what like a blowjob is? And I remember like Googling blue waffle for the first time at my friend's house and just being like, oh my God. And just
similar memories for me too of like everyone being like, you should Google this. Just look it up. Just Google it. Just see what it is. And it's like, oh my God. I can't believe that was like a running joke. Like that was like, like peak humor for us was just like telling people to just Google blue waffle. And it's like, do we not have better material? Like, is there nothing like,
it was like also at that time, like Two Girls in One Cup was out. So yeah. That was like, I never watched it to this day.
I know.
I don't want to watch it, but I know that it's sexual. And I was like, Two Girls in One Cup. I don't get it. But you know, whenever it was like me and my other friend and there was a cup, obviously that conversation always got brought up. So it was just like a lot of like exposing yourself to the stuff you didn't think you were going to be exposed to, I would say, is sort of how I got it. But when I got to high school, it was just extremely different. That's when I had like my feminist awakening, it's like really early. I would say I was maybe like 15 years old. I'd say I was about 15 when I read like Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands and This Bridge Called My Back, and learned like what it meant to be like a lesbian woman of color. And first, I think it was the first time, I think, throughout the entirety of the young adult novels that I've read, and then also my own coming of age, where I like found literature that was just like truly I could connect to. Like I could take my heart and put it in the pages and like feel Anzaldúa's heart like in the words and the prose that she was saying. And so I think it was through that book in particular that really sort of like made me reframe my body in like this very like liberatory way, where it was like, yeah, I bleed for X amount of days. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. But, like that's what makes me powerful and resilient. And it was a lot of that, and it was a lot of, oh, I don't have to like men. Wow. Like I don't have to marry a male.
Yeah, you're telling me.
Like I can just be with women for the rest. Wow. Just like love that.
I had that same exact thought. I want to say like maybe a year and a half ago, where I was just, I mean, at that point I'd been out and very comfortably, like I recognized that I was a lesbian. I was like, okay, men just, I've tried this. I've spent, however many years trying this and keep failing. It's not my thing, not working. And then I guess it was just like pretty recently I had that realization that like, oh, I only have to date women. Like I can just date women for the rest of my life. And I was like, this is great. Like,
amazing. Like I have a choice. Like, I was told my whole life I didn't, right? Like sex ed was also like very like cis and like very like penis and vagina. And I was like, but what about two vaginas or like two penises? Like what the fuck does that sex prevention and that health look like? But yeah, no, books are very amazing for stuff like that. So, yeah.
No, I love that, because I honestly think the first time I ever read like a romance novel that actually resonated with me was in this past like probably 6 months. I'm like, there was nothing for me growing up. Like all of the books that were like, here's like lesbians, like here's like there's two girls who are dating in this book, but like not really, because we don't want to explicitly say it. And like there wasn't very many resources. And I think there's also a lot of discomfort around it, because nobody ever sat me down and was like, hey, like, I mean, the funny part about this too is my aunt is like openly queer and has been for my entire life. Like this was never like a question, but I was still just like, I don't like, is this scandalous? Like, oh my God. Like I just felt so like, I can't like, I didn't even want to like Google the information. Like instead I would just Google like the am I gay quizzes, and that was the extent of my like.
Yes. Oh my God.
And I just like, yeah, I don't know. I just think about it. And I'm like, if I had even like one book, I think as a kid, that explicitly said, here is like a 16-year-old girl who is going through her first crush. It happens to be on her best friend who is also a female, this is the journey. It would have changed probably my entire trajectory. And I'm so like thankful that there's so much literature now for people who, are like myself, or maybe they're feeling a little bit like, where do I feel like, what's going on here? And it's becoming a little bit more comfortable. And we're actually seeing books, topping like best-selling lists that are about, LGBTQ kids. And I love that. I'm like, yes, every time I see a new one, I'm like,
yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's really nice to see this, like, there was this gap, I think, that was very prevalent in our literary canon when we were younger, of like very white protagonists, very like similar, like the heroes and the coming of age was like all relatively along a similar string, very heteronormative. And now, this past summer when I was working with social justice books and teaching for change, I like noticed this, like, I don't know, just like this explosion of literature that's like truly grappling with issues. And like in quarantine, I found myself like returning to literature, like to young adult literature that was probably published, 2 or 3 years ago. And I was like, where was this when I was 10?
Yep.
Like, where was this? And so it's also really nice to see that explosion, but also like still there's so much more to go, and there's still so much more to write, and so many voices that should be out there, really to have have young people connect with just like their lived realities and who they are becoming as people in our ever-changing world as well. So
yeah, no, I've been feeling the same way. Cause I mean, I've been keeping up with YA cause that's what I write. So for, you know, basically my entire life, I've been watching kind of YA charts and trends and kind of keeping up with like what direction. And like, I love reading YA. I love a good, easy read, just like something that I get to learn about, you know, the world around me through a different pair of eyes or whatever it might be. Or I just think the story is fun, but it's like, I do really feel like in the last couple of years, there's been such a shift into books that really are, I don't even know I don't want to say like mean something because obviously like books mean different things to everybody, but it's like books that are really trying to like teach people things and say something and really open eyes to, you know, what the world is for a lot of people. And honestly, just being able to find kind of like a little bit of like a safe space in that book and being able to find like a world that kind of works for you where you feel like you're seen and you feel like you're visible and somebody else understands who you are. Cause I just feel like I never really had anything like that growing up. And I would read and I mostly consumed like, you know, romantic comedies growing up. And I was like, okay, I sort of get it. But like, why do I not really get it? Like, yeah, I want that, but like not really. And I just, you know, that feeling was so confusing and nobody ever articulated for me, well, it's probably because you're not interested in men and that's okay. Here's some resources and here's what you can do. And maybe here's some like TV shows or something you can watch. And, you know, this might make you feel a little bit more at home or whatever it might be. Yeah. I'm just like, cause I want to say I've read maybe like 3 or 4 YA books with like, you know, sapphic love interests in it. And I'm like, this is exceptional. I'm like, I couldn't even find like one open. And it's like, I'm starting to see books that have like, you know, couples on the cover. Like it's like a noticeable, like it says like, yes, this book is queer. Like we have 2 love interests of, you know, the same gender or whatever it might be. And it's like, that is so exciting.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, in 2018, there was a study that was produced, I think, from the University of Wisconsin. I know it was Sarah Park and the last name, other person was Dalen. And I feel really bad for forgetting that. And it showed that like predominantly in the YA and children's literature canon, there are more books with like animal protagonists and white protagonists than also like any other race. And so to me, that's just like wild to see.
Wow.
Yeah. And to just notice and to realize and to be like, oh, so this was like in 2018, that's 2 years ago. Like there's still so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so much more to be written as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's such a key thing. And it's really, I mean, not to end up too much on a tangent of like what books need in terms of, but I think I really think there's such a, I don't know. I think it all comes back together because it really is like, you know, sex ed is more than just sex. And it's also books are more than just books and, you know, just reading and entertainment. It's like, you know, sex ed is a way to learn about relationships in the world around you in the same way books are. And it's like, you know, because I didn't feel at home in my sex ed classes because nobody ever talked to me in a way that made sense. Like nobody ever sat me down and just said very explicitly, this is fine. Like it's, you know, you don't have to keep dating men. Like it is okay. Like you don't have to try this. It would have saved me a whole bunch of time in like high school, like just trying to figure all that stuff out. And I feel like it's the same thing with, you know, books, of being able to find kind of a home and see yourself in it and feel comfortable and just, you know,
Books are definitely a window to our world and are very, like, they're just like a lens to how we can relate to ourselves and others in this very like weird, you know, thing called life. And I think that that's also the powerfulness of books too, especially young adult literature and fiction, where it is a space to like imagine the possibilities and to define a new meaning, create a new language that young people can relate to, and then like hopefully utilize to either articulate their own relationships to, you know, the spaces that they're in and the work that they do, but also just like to themselves as well. And so I think books are a very powerful thing for sure.
Yeah. No, and then, so when you're thinking about the different things that you kind of consumed, like, I know we've kind of already gone on this path, but how do you think these have affected you as a person? Like, it's, you know, when you think about all of the different lessons you were told, the books you consumed, the shows you watched, what your parents told you, like, collectively, like, what do you think that meant for you? And do you think it shifted over time?
Yeah. So I would say, like, for me, leading up until high school, it was very like just going to experiment, try to get as much knowledge. And then when I got to high school, I joined debate. I read Borderlands, and then I went to like this, I would say the summer into junior year was like my summer where everything that I thought I knew about gender, sexuality, race, and class in like a very conservative, closed-minded way was just like bobbled on its head. And so there was this camp, it's still around now, it's called the Women's Debate Institute. And what it is an organization run by women for individuals or young people who identify as women, or have at some point in their life. And they take 65 young women to the northern woods of Minnesota, and we have conversations about like feminisms and capitalism and race and gender and class. There were sections where the social worker Dev Makut, she led discussions on like safe sex, and so we would do the thing that you were talking about earlier. We would put a note that's like how to give a good blowjob, and like she would just like talk about it. But it was like also the first space where people were like very open about what did it mean to be like a young girl, like in this environment, right? And being a young girl and going through like body issues and going through self-esteem and like having to deal with like the cis white dudes from like the suburbs who clearly are uncomfortable when you go into a debate round and talk about your period. And so, I don't know, it was like a very liberating thing. And then when I got back to high school, I just became a wild ass feminist. And I would like bake uterus cookies and I would bring them to school. And I would like tell people, you know, this is a woman's uterus. I would take like little pearl decorators from like, they're in like a bottle. And I would like put eggs in the uteruses and like bring them and just say, you know, here's the uterus, like eat it. Like it's uterus Thursday. We're going to have a fun day today. And then also just like being very sort of like open with what did it mean to like bleed. And this is like very turfy first wave feminist of me, but I was also 16, y'all. So like cut me some slack. Like it's a thing. So I don't know, I would say it was like very closed-minded until I was given this space to like really challenge my own thought through, you know, the mentorship of other amazing women, many who identify as Black and brown and queer, that I think really liberated me from the own socialization that was created by a very not so great sex education. And I think that also developed better relationships to my body. And I think that when I then went to college and I was having more sex, being that like college kid and freshman who's like wild somewhat, but also not really, it gave me like sort of a framework to like operate within, you know? And it gave me sort of like this feeling of like comfort and this, knowing that if there were problems that I was having sexually, I did have a community to fall back on. And it might not have been my community back home, you know, in my household or, you know, anyone who I engaged with in middle school, but it could be these like group of radical women provided to me by the WDI that I can go to and be like, all right, so like, let's talk about like what an IUD is, or like, let's talk about what, you know, other forms of birth control are. And so it was just a very like slope up, and then now I'm here where I'm like, yes, like let's talk about sex, like moan as loud as you can, like have fun while you do it, you know. The vagina monologues was like very impactful to me as a young person. Just like watching these brilliant actors at the West Virginia University Creative Arts Center like just moan very loudly was something that I've now adopted into my own practice. It's great. So.
No, I love this idea of community that you're bringing up, because I think there really is such a sense of like it's really nice to have people to go to when you have questions, and it's really nice to be able to just say like, okay, so what's going on? Like I'm hearing about this new form of birth control, or I'm hearing about this thing, or, you know, I think something might be weird with my body, but I'm not really sure. And like, I don't know who to ask or where to go. And I think there really is such a wonderful thing that can come out of having people to talk to very openly. And I think that's something that I've really loved growing up, is like being able to go back to people and kind of just have these conversations about like what's going on. And I think part of that is, because of my genuine like academic interests. So it's like, I would be having these like casual conversations with people and I'd be like, oh, tell me more.
Yeah, no, that's literally how I am too. I'm like, oh, so like, let's talk about sex, baby. Like, let's do it. And people are like, Kassie, like some people need you to ease into that. I'm like, I know, but like, it's natural. It's like how you're made, right? Like you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for sex. Like, so, yeah, it's something that makes me very excited and happy about. And I think community definitely does make it a lot better. Especially, as a young girl and you're in these spaces with other young girls between the ages of like 13 and 17, right? And just really sort of having those connections, whether that's like intergenerationally where you're able, as a 14-year-old to talk to a 17-year-old, like, did you have it yet? Or like, is nice. And it's very comforting. I think what was also really great about the community was that it showed that you didn't have to have sex with men, right? Like they very clearly made that clear. They were like, no, like you can have sex with people who identify as a male, who are trans, who you can have sex with women, you can have sex with people who don't fall into either category of what does it mean to be a human being on this planet and who really just defy gender roles, which is like beautiful. And so I think that it was a lot of like the intersectional understandings of sex and sexuality and gender that was missing from our education, that was only provided through a community of nurturing older women who really cared about what these young girls were consuming and were learning about themselves and their sexuality and like what makes them feel good and like what doesn't, and how to like really vocalize that and generate that confidence to where when they do go out, they have like the voice and the agency to like really sort of communicate and like do it in a way where they're comfortable learning about their bodies and like their sexual desires in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I love that you had the chance to actually do that with other people, because for me, it was, like Tumblr, like that was like the source of all of my, so it's like, in some ways there were benefits too, because I really do think somehow, some way I managed to learn, things, and it did change my perspective and it opened up my eyes to a lot of things that I just was never really taught. Like it just was not part of the conversation really. And nobody was like going to sit me down and have these like conversations about what gender is and like, kind of what, like where we all fit as people into society and like all of these different questions where I was kind of like, what's going on? Like, like, I don't understand like all of the, like, there's so much more that's going on beyond me. And I just like, don't have any resources to find it. And I think I had to use Tumblr for better or for worse. And that was kind of the starting point for me. And then it wasn't until college where I really felt like I had like communities of people where I could actually talk about this stuff. And I was like, oh, people get me. Like it's, like it's okay. Like I have real people who I can actually talk to and I can like have these real conversations with about, our daily lives and what's going on beyond our daily lives and kind of just what's happening. I think it's kind of the overall point. Yeah.
That's very beautiful. I think that we're fortunate enough to have grown up in the beginning of the digital age. That sounds also like very prehistoric, like but like, we did grow, I remember still like dial up AOL. So
yep.
We were like in the beginning, people were like, oh, we're bored of technology. I'm like, no, I know what a fax machine is and a floppy disk. But I think that the internet was really helpful. And I remember I was never allowed to have a Tumblr. And I think a lot of it was just because my mom was like scared that I would be exposed to things, but like I had a Facebook, which was like totally fine. Right. Yeah. And so I think it's also interesting to know that there's like, not just like the physical communities of people that we can create within the spaces that we occupy, whether that's through debate camp or through college, but also like there are virtual communities too that like put resources out there. So like young people even people now, like there's still so much I don't know about sex, right? Can just go out and read and learn more about. And I think that that's like the beauty of like community building and like just putting information out there because someone might need it versus sort of like restricting information from people because it is something that you're timid and like scared to talk about, right? Or don't think that we should talk about it, which we both know is bullshit. So
Yeah, I really think there's something, I don't even know how to describe it, but something really powerful about recognizing that sometimes people just don't want to talk about it. And it's like when people say we don't want to talk about it, you're inherently limiting the people who do want to talk about it. You know what I mean? Like you're making it more difficult for, you know, me to be able to learn about myself because it makes you uncomfortable. So it's like we're kind of at that point dependent on other resources for better or for worse. You know, we might find good stuff or we might end up down, you know, rabbit holes of not so occasionally false, but sometimes just like information that might not be communicated in a proper way, or like, you know, I might just be too young or too inexperienced to actually understand what they're trying to explain to me, or I might just not have the right vocabulary or whatever it might be if I end up finding stuff online. So it's like, I don't know, I feel like we need to have people who are willing to have these conversations with us. And I think that's something that we need to steer adults away from, is kind of this idea of like, it's okay to just say, I don't want to talk about it, because it's either you do it or
you're going to get misinformation.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, I think uncomfortability is good. And that's a practice. That's something that I try to incorporate into my everyday life. It's just, how do we break down these walls of, are you uncomfortable because like your kid is asking you this and now you have to like share this moment of intimacy, or like, are you uncomfortable because you also have like some suppressed relationships to sex and sexual desires, and what does it mean to be pleasurable and confident in your body and the way that you choose to exert love to someone who you are with, or someone who you're not with, who you just want to feel warm with at night because it's cold outside, right? And so lots of just frustration, I think, that comes from people being uncomfortable. But the way that we can break that mold is by creating these conversations and creating spaces where we can just be open about this, and we can talk about sex, and we can talk about like what to do and what not to do in terms of safe sex. And then, you know, creating these spaces where we openly welcome people to come and to engage with us, and hopefully that reaches their lives in some way. And then we're able to build this community that's very open to talk about the things that are uncomfortable to others.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, so is there anything that you feel like you didn't learn early in life that you feel like you were missing? Like, was there anything where it's like it took you what felt like centuries to actually arrive at like a certain thing? I know you've mentioned, you know, kind of your journey of learning about different aspects of yourself, learning about others, learning about sex, learning about relationships. Was there anything that just like seemed to fall through the cracks and you were like, I cannot believe I didn't know that when I was like 16?
Going to the gynecologist. Like I am about to be 23. I went to the gynecologist for the first time like 3 weeks ago. Like, I don't know why it took me so long. Maybe it was just because like the scare that like someone is just like putting something up my vagina. But like I've also had that done before. So I don't know why it was really that scary. But like go to the gynecologist. Like that is something that needs to happen. Get a pap smear. It's going to be uncomfortable. But like it's absolutely necessary. Like get your Gardasil shot. Like women's health, I think, is also something that's really taboo. And I think that for me, growing up in a Latino household, it was just like not ever really talked about until when I got older. When my mother survived breast cancer, she was like, oh, well, like now you need to go. And I'm like, oh, but I didn't even know this doctor existed. And so I would say that is something I wish they talked more about, which is going to the OBGYN, talking about what an IUD does, talking about like things to like start screening for, like PCOS, if you know that you're meeting particular symptoms, especially if you have grown up like me, just like casually just a chunky, lovely fat person. Yeah, I mean, I think that the more that we're able to talk about vaginas, we're able to talk about women's health, the better we are. Get STD tested. That's important. Make sure that you continue to use safe sex and like continue to use condoms so that way you have safe sex, right? But yeah, I don't know. I think that was something that definitely slipped through the cracks, and sort of like preventing yourself from exposure, really, and making sure that you're also doing your part to make sure that you're okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really kind of wonderful note to wrap up on. I mean, if you have any other stories or little anecdotes that you wanted to share, just for the sake of, just for the sake of sharing them.
I think I'm good. I think I got almost everything. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. Before we, tune out, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sex Ed Taught Me. Thank you for supporting this podcast and supporting this kind of, ridiculous hodgepodge idea that I came up with, because I wanted to see it and try it out and see what happens. A huge thank you to Jake Miller, who is the editor and kind of just he mixes the podcast, he puts this all together for us. I honestly think he's the reason why you're even hearing it right now. So huge thank you to him, and huge thank you to our guests who are coming onto the show. If you are interested, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Sex Ed Taught Me. So hopefully it should be pretty easy to find. And if you want to send anything in to us, if you would like to be a guest, if you just have a funny story you'd like to share, if you have any questions or things you want to clarify or whatever reason it might be, you can also email us at sexedtaughtme@gmail.com. But again, thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time.